While the existence of bulbancha is probably the most unreported fact about New Orleans history, the concept of quadroon balls and plaçage is perhaps the most over-reported and embellished myth of New Orleans history. The legend holds that regular balls were held at the Orleans Ballroom and sometimes the Globe Theater that allowed women of color and white men to mix with the intention of finding a patron or protector who would provide for the woman and their children in an arrangement known as plaçage. In this arrangement, the white man had another white family who lived in a different house with him. He was responsible for providing a home and necessities for his placé and any children, but they did not live together. In Creole, the history and legacy of Louisiana's free people of color, Joan M. Martin's essay, Plaçage and the Louisiana Gens de Couleur Libre, How Race and Sex Define the Lifestyles of Free Women of Color, explains that this process was similar to debutante balls of society people and that the mothers were involved in the arrangements. Further, Martin asserts that this wasn't simply about sex, but the only option for free women of color in this period, as they were not legally allowed to marry outside of their race or marry enslaved people. Their only option to have a family in advance was to live as a placé. But modern research shows that the reports of the quadroon balls have been greatly exaggerated. In her book, The Strange History of the American Quadroon, Free Women of Color in the Revolutionary Atlantic World, Emily Clark's more recent research finds no evidence of plaçage contracts in the historical record, and very little evidence of quadroon balls. There is evidence of mixed-race families living together in 19th century New Orleans, but these relationships were more like a common-law marriage than a plaçage arrangement as described today, and only because it was not legal for people of different races to marry. The quadroon balls that occurred were likely for the pleasure of tourists who came to expect them based on reports from others that made their way around the world in sensationalistic newspaper articles, such as this 1852 article by Sir Edward Robert Sullivan, one of the few who actually claimed to attend a ball, which appeared in an English newspaper. While he describes the dancing in some detail, he spends 2/3 of his space discussing the murders that occurred while he was here. Quote, "As I was going up the stairs after getting my ticket
and replying to the quiet request whether I would leave my arms, that I had none to leave, I was stopped and searched from head to foot by a policeman, who, I suppose, fancied it impossible that I should be altogether without arms. Notwithstanding all this chaos, murders and duels are of weekly occurrences at these balls, and during my stay at New Orleans there were 3. There are more murders here than in any other city in the Union."
Unquote. Scholars note that this relentless myth of plaçage rests on the perception of women of African descent as irresistible seductresses who sought the favors of white men and could even be blamed for their position as a placé. Emily Clark refutes this as incongruent with the historical record about free women of color in the 19th century, who were devout family women, according to the documentation. In a 2018 interview with Lane Kaplan Levinson for the podcast Tripod New Orleans at 300, in honor of the 300th anniversary of the colonization of New Orleans, Dr. Clark said,
"And so we rob them of having attained the ideal of being a lady when we erase their story and instead accept what was the story told about all black women, which was that, it's not white men's fault that they go to bed with black women, and even that they rape them. It's the women's fault because they are so seductive. It's what they want. So it's that old story that's told, it's in the news right now. It's always the woman's fault. Well, it wasn't the woman's fault. And so when we buy this myth, we're buying into that really old, socially destructive, and just plain not historically accurate idea about women of African descent.
Let's consider this myth old news and accept that free women of color and white men lived in partnerships throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in New Orleans. They were not equal in their day, and they could not marry. But sources show that the partnerships were as loving as any between a white man and woman were at the time. Their status as, quote, ladies, was robbed from them in their time, but through modern research we can return it to them in ours now. The loving and loyal relationships of free women of color and white men along with the violent and forced relationships of the enslaved with enslavers, led to the Creole mixture of race in their children that New Orleans is famous for. But this truth is not unique to New Orleans. Dr. Clark also points out that the quadroon as a concept was not born in New Orleans, nor was it relegated to New Orleans in the antebellum times. In fact, it is well known on Ancestry DNA forums that all African Americans are likely to have significant European ancestry, not just those from the South, and not just the Creoles of New Orleans. Similarly, it is not uncommon for those with primarily European ancestry to find African ancestry in their results. This is often attributed to rape during slavery, which was common, but there were also free people of color who, quote, passed as white, and married white people, or just lived with a partner like marriage even though they couldn't marry, such as the story of Mrs. Henri Parlong, mother of the two sisters of the court. Perhaps because New Orleans had the largest and most prosperous population of free people of color, that this myth has survived and prospered here the most. Certainly, as Dr. Clark points out, it's at least in part the result of racism and those who couldn't fathom a world where a free woman of color would want to marry a black man and must seduce white men. I have been told my whole life, and in turn told visitors, that New Orleans is the most European city in America. While this is possibly true, it certainly erases the other cultures that have mixed to create this culture, primarily starting with the Native Americans and Africans, but also the people of South America, the Caribbean, and even Asia, who found their homes at the mouth of the Mississippi River. New Orleans isn't the most European city in America. New Orleans is the most post-colonial American city. This rich and intertwined gumbo of cultures drapes details on the sharp corners of truth without any need for myth or legend.